Thanks so much, everyone. We're about to begin our panel this afternoon. I will just recognize that the panel members are here to discuss the critical minerals strategy, and will be moderated by Fotini Koutsalvis, who is the Vice President, Economic Affairs and Climate Change with the Mining Association of Canada. Fotini, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matthew, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. We could do better. Come on. Good afternoon, everyone. Energy into the room. Well, I'm very excited about this panel, and especially right after the ambassador's remarks. I think it's going to be a great conversation with some wonderful panelists. So let me introduce them to you. Right next to me, we have Chris Doornbos, and he is the president and CEO of Lithium. Then we have Saga Williams, who's the senior advisor, external relations for the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Oh, wow, now everyone can hear me, great. Then we have Scott MacKenzie. We have Marcella Munro. Scott's not wearing the green jacket. It's Marcella Munro, head of government and regulatory affairs at Teck Resources Limited. And then we have Scott MacKenzie, director, corporate and external affairs, Toyota Canada Inc. How about it, like a little bit of applause for the panelists. So get us all started. Great. Okay. Wonderful. So we just heard the ambassador, and I wrote some quick notes about how governments need to move quickly, how we're in the pole position in the critical mineral race. And it is a race. It's a race for economic, business opportunities, for the environment, and especially for the energy transition. And as Matthew mentioned, this panel today will be discussing Natural Resources' recently released critical mineral strategy. And its intent is to increase the supply of responsibly sourced critical minerals and support the development of domestic and global value chains for the green and digital economy. So this panel is very unique because you have the entire ecosystem, an entire value chain for the critical minerals strategy. In this panel, we have end users, we have partners and stakeholders, and we have the upstream portion of the value chain. So what I'm going to ask each of these panelists, from where you sit, from your own mandate, vision, objectives, and outcomes for your own organization, give us your first thoughts with respect to the strategy. What does it mean for you? What does it mean for your stakeholders? And I know there's probably a number of government officials in the room, a number of government officials listening online. So what they would like to know is, what are the actions? How does the strategy get implemented in the short term, in the long term, that will have the most impact for your organizations? So maybe I could start with all speakers, it says. So I will start with you, Chris, and then we'll go down through the other speakers as well.
Just trying to be succinct, I think on the short term, echoing Ambassador Cohen, opening doors, right? In the short term, if we want our critical minerals industry from bottom to top, we need to really look at what doors need to be opened or open wider that aren't today. And that's a broad spectrum. So it could be government funding, could be permitting, it could be support in other areas, could be, companies like us, we're a public traded company. A lot of the capital requires from the public market. So those types of support from government, open source capital markets, the whole ecosystem is there. I think in the long term, we're probably more looking at keeping as much of this as we can local to Canada. So we have an opportunity to develop a large amount of the supply chain. You've heard ministers like Champagne talk a lot about building a battery ecosystem in Canada. So we have a lot of the critical raw materials. That's a strength that Canada has, but we can also produce the refined products for the battery industry. We can also produce some of the battery components to the cars themselves. So I think there's lots of long-term opportunity for Canada to participate in a broad spectrum.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And I do like the Made in Canada approach, establishing the entire value chain within Canada and adding value along every single link on that chain. And I think this is what makes this panel so unique, is that we have those links within this conversation as well. Saga, from where you sit, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to your organization? And how is it going to be meaningful in terms of implementing?
Well, thank you for that. I also want to thank Matt in terms of acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, as represented by Pikwakanagan. And I think it's important to note when we're talking about critical mineral development that we talk about it in the context of this development happening on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across this country. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because where we're coming from as Indigenous peoples, as First Nations people, is from a rights-based perspective and a caretaking role in terms of looking at not only how we position ourselves right now in the context of looking at opportunities within the critical mineral field, but looking at making sure that that's done in a sustainable way for 7 generations ahead. And as a former leader in my community, as an elected councillor, that's something we looked at in terms of ensuring that we proceeded in participation on resource development activities in the context of making sure that we brought our community along from our elders' perspective to our youth perspective. So I think it's really important that we look at critical mineral development in that context and include Indigenous in an ESGI framework, because I think that makes this whole process very comprehensive. And as you said, we're all in here together and we all have a stake in ensuring that we participate in the growing economy of this country and that we achieve net zero by 2035, and that's incumbent upon us all to be a part of that process. Gosh.
Wonderful, thank you. Marcella, from Teck's perspective.
Thanks so much. And again, thanks to the Chamber for organizing today. I think it's been super helpful. I guess I want to start from Teck's perspective by recognizing how much we appreciate the hard work of all the folks in the federal government that put this strategy together. We certainly, I'm sure they're sick of hearing from all of us, but we certainly feel that our voices were heard loud and clear. And we were really encouraged to see the way it's framed in the sense that, obviously Teck, our core values of sustainability, of ensuring that we do work in a way that's respectful to our Indigenous partners and under UNDRIP, and to make sure that Canada can play the role that it should be playing in providing the metals and materials to decarbonize the world. This framework is exactly where Teck sits. I think where we come at it, like what's next for Teck on this question. I mean, there's 2 things. One, there are a couple of very significant opportunities within Canada for Teck to increase our presence, particularly on copper. So we look at the strategy and we say there's over $1.5 billion meant for infrastructure, for critical minerals. Our Galore Creek, which is a co-partnership with Newmont in what's called the Golden Triangle in British Columbia, although the NISGA want us to call it the Golden Circle to make sure they're included, which we're happy to do. But again, we have good relationships already with the Tahltan. The fact is that project and there's many around it that could be that could be in production in 4 to 5 years as opposed to 20 years. If we can get those roads and that electricity infrastructure, would also empower the local Indigenous communities. So it's a win-win. And we think those kind of projects are exciting for us. And it makes us look at investing more money in Canada. We're an America's company, so we produce in Alaska, Canada, as well as into South America, but we do, our home is Canada. We want to stay rooted here. And I think the strategy also recognizes significant challenges. So I know we're going to talk about UNDRIP in a second, but the fact is we know we have a permitting challenge. It can't take 25 years for a greenfield operation to start up. It shouldn't take 10 years to get new electricity to electrify our sites. But it has to be done in a way that recognizes and respects Indigenous governments. And so, we really feel that this is an opportunity for the federal government to be a bigger part of that conversation with the provinces and make sure that we don't want no regulations. We want to be permitted but we need certainty. We need to know when those investments can be made. And so that I think hopefully in this moment, geopolitically, with climate change, where we really need to work on our production, we think we've got a great moment here to do that in a sustainable way. And we're glad the federal government's recognized it.
Thank you kindly, Marcella. And I do like the point of being very direct in terms of the roads to resources, infrastructure spending on energy to be able to open those corridors and build it, and they will come. And we want Teck to spend their money, your money, not your money, but Teck's money in Canada. We don't want it to go to projects elsewhere. We want to keep the projects building and developing within a Canadian context. And that's what your company needs to be able to actually make those decisions. So it's something that I think it's important for the government to also hear in terms of what are those things that they need to think on in terms of support for those projects. So thank you for that. So not to say last but not least,
Oh,
but
come on.
Scott, as an automotive company, Toyota, what is it that you need from the upstream part of the value chain? What is it that you need from the critical mineral strategy that we've all read many times back to front, to be able to realize some of those opportunities from a Canadian context?
Yeah, thank you. I joke with Marcella sometimes that, we're either upstream or downstream of each other, or maybe bookends of the, of a process. And, Toyota is the largest automotive manufacturer on earth. And we're also the largest automotive manufacturer in Canada. And, we're pretty proud of all of the cars that we make in Canada. And, going forward, the industry is moving towards electrification. We know that. We can debate how quick that's going to happen, but it's absolutely going to happen. And what I really need is two things, speaking on behalf of Toyota. And one is an understanding around supply and demand, and the other thing is alignment. And when I talk about alignment, right now, automotive companies are being mandated to sell a certain portion of electrified vehicles in Canada, and this is happening around the world, and it's a good thing. It's driving us all towards less emissions in the future. I could debate about specific policy outcomes, but it's a good thing to do. The challenge around that is we have to sell a certain number of cars, as an example, in Canada, in the United States, wherever it happens to be, at a set period of time. But based on things that have happened recently, including the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the batteries and components that are going into those cars need to be made locally. And that's a good thing. It's a great thing for Canada. It's opportunity for investments. It's fantastic, but the supply chain feeding into that needs to be there as well, including the critical minerals. Like on a near weekly basis, I have a conversation with someone about, the opportunities for investment in Canadian mining and, processing of minerals, cathode, anode, all of the components going into a battery. It's a great opportunity for Canada, but it all has to move at the same pace. And I'll come back to the supply and demand portion. If we're ramping up production of cars and we're ramping up production of batteries, as an example, the raw materials have to be there as well in Canada, or else we're going to be in the same position that we were in before and importing those things from other places. So it comes down to speed. And, I won't repeat what other people have said about, regulatory processes needing to be faster, but it's more an issue of alignment. We all have to move at the same speed, or else it's not going to work.
Great, thank you, Scott. And it's music to the Mining Association of Canada's ears to hear that, Toyota, the largest auto manufacturing company, needs more mining and needs more mining as quickly as possible in mining and metal processing, and needs that to be local. Why? Because you want to be close to your customers and close to the resource. And why? Because Canada has, a wonderful reputation for sustainable mining practices as well. So there's many benefits in terms of why Toyota would want to resource or source the materials from Canadian mining companies, but we just need to have more mines open. So hopefully those who make decisions are also able to better understand the challenges in terms of having more mining operations moving forward and being able to support those with solutions as well. I'm going to move on to the next question. This one is for Saga and Marcella. A key objective of the critical minerals strategy is to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The government of Canada has committed to continue and expanded Indigenous engagement, partnerships, and funding. And Ottawa has also recommitted to honoring treaty obligations. What is the current dynamic from your point of view between mining firms and Indigenous communities across Canada. Further, from your operational perspective, what are the actions? What are the things that need to be done by government and by the private sector as well to strengthen those partnerships and relationships with Indigenous communities? Saga, could I start with you? And I think Marcella could take it on hot pursuit right afterwards.
Sounds good. I think in terms of providing the opportunities to implement reconciliation within a framework of resource extraction, you need to build the capacity of Indigenous communities to have conversations to look at where there's opportunities for relationship development and opportunities for partnerships. So one of the things that the coalition is looking at is creating a national framework and lobbying efforts to create a national framework for access to capital. Because without the capital, you don't have the ability to really participate in conversations where we're talking about economic reconciliation. And that's certainly the approach that the coalition has taken in terms of participation for First Nations people in critical mineral development. So whether it's buying into the existing or newly developed infrastructure to support mining activities, or whether it's looking at building the capacity of communities to create other avenues for participation. Those opportunities do exist, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to look for where those partnerships can happen. And one of the things that on my way here from my home community of Curve Lake, which is about 3.5-hour drive, I got a message from the technicians I work with at the Anishinaabe Nation talking about Ontario's newly announced amendments to their mining legislation, and identifying some of the gaps that exist in terms of, I know one of our MPs here mentioned that we need to speed up regulatory processes. And certainly from an Indigenous perspective, we feel that urgency, but we also don't want to be left behind in the urgent move to regulate and to create mines across this country. We want to be partners in creating the environmental oversight that will generate mining activity in this country, and we want to do it in a way that promotes our participation in that process. And I think if we do those things, we will achieve economic reconciliation and empower our communities in ways that we haven't seen happen. And we have to do that by building up our capacity to have a strong workforce, but also strong leadership in terms of being able to negotiate good agreements and create good partnerships. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know how I would add to that, except to say, yes, we agree with all of that. Look, for Teck, it's about making sure that we are always respectful of the rights, interests, and aspirations, I think, of First Nations people in the places where we operate. And so that's a core principle. We have about 100 agreements across our operations with Indigenous partners and nations. We're really interested in and eager as we move forward with new projects or even expansion of old ones. How do we do this differently? To Saga's point, like what other kinds of participation could there be? You know, we're quite willing to talk about all forms of financial structures, equity. We just think it's a very important thing to really live up to our commitment to UNDRIP. And so that's, I think, as a company, you kind of have to, it's one thing to come out with a policy statement saying, yes, we agree with the government that UNDRIP should be put into legislation, and then you have to live it in your day-to-day operations, which with what we try to do. For those of you that don't know, I always bring this up because it's a positive example from the past. So our Alaska mine is a zinc mine. It's one of the biggest zinc mines in the world. It's a partnership, a 50-50 partnership with the NANA Corporation, which is 100% wholly owned by the Inupiat people. And so that mine has been operating. It's a great North American supply chain story. That mine's been operating for almost 40 years now, where they have, like I said, a 50% ownership stake, hundreds of millions of dollars going into that community. They also are in charge of both the contracting locally as well as what that workforce looks like. So it's a massive success story, and about 40% of that zinc comes to our Trail smelter in BC and then gets exported as lead and zinc phosphate into the North American market. So you can see right there just that important relationship, and that wouldn't have been possible without actually the leadership of the NANA people, with the Inupiat people in NANA Corporation, who came to Teck 40 years ago and said, we need to cooperate with someone. We want to build this mine. And so I think, we think that these are new things. They're not. And there's lots of great examples to look at. And so that's where Teck sits. We want to keep doing more of that as we go forward.
Thank you so much. And that last example just gives me the shivers, to be honest with you. And it's such a wonderful best practice, and which, many other operations and perhaps other communities can also learn from as well. And I think that's a lot of the great work the coalition does also, is bringing those experiences and knowledge together through projects and with communities to build that capacity, and also have that, the core principle of collaboration and being heard and being a partnership in terms of those projects. And that's also, a very big kudos to the coalition for a lot of that work that you're doing as well. So I'm going to pivot again to another question. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and this is for Scott, and I'll let Marcella catch her breath for a moment. And we heard the ambassador's comments quite clearly about the importance of continued collaboration between Canada and the United States. The work that governments are undertaking with respect to the Joint Action Plan and some of the outcomes of that action plan from a number of years ago, and that the IRA it shouldn't be a competitive approach, but one that we see as being facilitative in terms of a Canadian and American collaboration and partnership in establishing those value chains. Could I ask, how do you assess the current relationship between Canada and the US? No, and we could talk hockey and beer, but I'm talking more about critical mineral value chains. And what would you like to see in terms of increased cooperation, especially in critical mineral development? Scott, could I start with you?
Oh, where do I start? Years ago, we had NAFTA, and then we went through renegotiation of NAFTA, and we ended up with the USMCA, or CUSMA as we call it in Canada. And that's basically an agreement for the three countries that are a part of that, US, Mexico, and Canada, to work together in many spaces, but that includes obviously automotive. And we're working along, localizing more content to be compliant to CUSMA or NAFTA. And then, last year it was Build Back Better. And that was potentially going to change the landscape to the point where vehicles made in Canada and also not unionized at the time would miss out on a $12,500 consumer incentive for the US. And now we're looking at the IRA, where the consumer incentive at least includes vehicles made in Canada and Mexico under certain conditions. But then you've got manufacturing tax credits that only apply to US made products. So I understand the intent of the ambassador's remarks, but there's still some challenges there that we have to navigate through. So, I agree with the spirit that, we absolutely should not be competing, and we should be working together. And basically, I used the word alignment in my previous remarks, and I'll say it again now, like the three countries in the NAFTA region. And frankly, some of our partners around the world should be aligned in terms of what we're doing, and there should be less friction and more collaboration. But I'm not sure we're there yet.
Marcella, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, I thought Ambassador Cohen's remarks today were just excellent, because I do, agree that we don't need to be competing. This isn't the competition you're looking for, kind of thing. We know where we're competing. I think what I would add, it's certainly part of Teck's interest in what I think it was heard loud and clear by the Canadian government as they built the critical mineral strategy. I believe the US government, that it's interesting to watch the rhetoric change over the last year, because at first it was very much like North American, and then companies like Toyota or Teck or others pointed out there's a global supply chain here. And we're not going to disrupting that supply chain that's quite successful and in areas, especially where there are a lot of the folks that we would consider allied countries are receiving or buying those materials in our case, Korea, Japan, etc. Like that needs to be a part of the conversation too. So I do think of it as Americas. As I said, we always say at Teck, we produce north-south, but our materials tend to go east-west. Does some of that go into the United States? Of course, 100%. Are we looking for more opportunities to change or just grow our trail smelter to make sure that we're producing as much of the critical minerals and smaller critical minerals that North America needs? Absolutely. We'll be looking at recycling there as well. But you don't want to interrupt the fact that we're successfully producing copper in Canada and Chile, for example, that the world needs, and that product is going to countries where we do have common interests, whether that's into Germany, into Japan, into Korea, Taiwan, India, places that are going to be very important to us to deal with climate change. So I think that to me is what's important right now is you can feel that conversation pivoting so that we're not just so looking into North America, but we understand that this is a global conversation. And I think you heard that today. So I think, we're moving in the right direction as far as what we worry about at Teck.
Great. And energy transition is a global issue, not just a Canadian and a US concern. So I do appreciate that remark in terms of energy transition in other countries as well, needing raw materials to be able to actually meet those commitments as well. Chris, I've had you too quiet. We need you to hear you speak. The North American zero emission vehicle market alone is estimated to reach $174 billion by 2030. So what does that mean? It means about 220,000 jobs in mining, processing, manufacturing. And of course, electric vehicles require batteries made with lithium, your favorite commodity, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements. So question to you and also to Scott, as we're looking upstream and downstream. So the two bookends, as you call it, Scott, as well as governments work together to ensure secure and sustainable supply of these minerals to support the growing demand for electric vehicles. And we heard from Scott in terms of that alignment and projects to move as quickly as the end users moving so that the raw materials are there to supply the further downstream as well. In your opinion, where are those gaps? Where are those challenges? Do you think we're on track? I have like 5 questions in this question. Do you think we're on track to have the supply of materials needed by downstream domestic manufacturers as well as global allies? We just heard Marcella, it is a insatiable global appetite for raw materials currently. So could I start with you? And then I'm sure Scott will have some thoughts to add as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to bluntly answer the question, are we on track? We're not to keep up with critical minerals supply to the growing demand. One of the heads of Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, which is a think tank organization looking at critical minerals and focus a lot of energy on the components of cathodes, and lithium being obviously one of those, is that mining and manufacturing for batteries are not in the same time zone. And what he's trying to say is really that it does take significantly longer, even with permitting reform, with incentivization, all of the things that we're talking about here under this action plan. The two are still on a different time frame. You can build a gigafactory in 2 years. It is just, there's no world where a mine can be built from, I just found this thing in the ground, to a processing facility that's operating in 2 years. And so when you look at it, like where incentivization needs to happen, it truly ends up being at that bottom end of the supply chain, because it's the one that takes the longest. It's the highest risk capital. Generally, mining and processing of minerals, and E3 falls into sort of this weird middle ground because we make it out of brines. The time and value that it costs to develop a mine is significantly higher risk capital. So there's more failures in mining than there are successes, because it's a complicated, uncertain game until you get to the point where where E3's at, where you're more talking about the cost to design and build a facility, but all the exploration side of things. So all of those things, all of that to say that Scott's making a very good point when he talks about alignment. And the way what it ends up coming down to, if you dig into the granularity of it, is that it has to be unfortunately bottom heavy in terms of incentivization. We need to incentivize the development of the raw materials more. And it is nice to see that mindset has changed in government. I know that the IRA and even Canada government has incentives for the purchase of the vehicles. And I think that goes a long way to incentivize the movement towards electrification. And that's a really important piece of it. But the gross funding needs to flow probably more preferentially into the higher risk areas to enable them to keep up to the supply chain challenges that we're having.
And I just want to clarify, when you say the bottom end, you mean upstream. So, okay,
Upstream or
just like, so
or
I
the
think,
base of the pyramid.
yeah, because downstream's gotten a lot of funding and incentives from the mining association's perspective. We need more incentives and support for upstream. I just want to make sure that's on the record, right, Chris?
Upstream
Okay.
or the bottom of the pyramid, yes, just to
Okay.
be clear. But yes,
To be clear.
the raw materials.
Wonderful. So high risk, high reward, patient capital.
Yeah.
We need to have a bit more support to get those projects unstuck and moving quicker than we have been in recent times.
Yeah, and that's what
Yeah.
I said, open doors. I mean, it is permitting, it's capital, both private and public. Government support enables, when you, like, we received a grant from the Strategic Innovation Fund, but it's a payback on capital we need to have in the bank, but it provides certainty to funders from the capital markets that the government is supportive of a project, and so they have more confidence to bring capital into it.
Absolutely. Investors' confidence is key to and critical to project success. Scott, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. First of all, I'm completely aligned with what Chris said. And, I talked earlier about alignment, and I also talked about supply and demand. And, personally, we met as a council this morning, before we came into this room, but I had at least 3 or 4 people make comments to me about, the wait time to get a Toyota hybrid or a plug-in hybrid. And I love answering those
It was
questions.
like the running gag. Of the
Yeah,
morning.
I love answering those questions, by the way, but we don't want to disappoint customers, but we have a supply and demand imbalance right now in automotive, and that the supply chain's not able to support the demand. And it is improving, it's getting better, and we hope it stabilizes and goes away. But you're going to have the same problem going forward, looking across the whole supply chain. And, Chris talked about 2 years to make a gigafactory. We're a little bit slower, we're about 30 months, but anyway, the point is still valid. You can build an automotive assembly plant in 2 years. You can build a battery plant in, 2.5 years. And who knows how long it is to, put a processing plant in place, or even commission a mine. But, I'll go back to my other point. If they're not all moving in harmony, you're going to have a supply and demand imbalance, and that creates problems. And the environment we're in right now is a regulatory space where governments, not just the Canadian government, but provincial governments and then governments around the world, are asking the automotive industry to go faster, build battery electric cars in particular in much greater numbers. And we'd like to go faster. And we're working very hard to go faster, but we need everybody to move along with us. And there's not a lot of value in building for instance, a battery plant, with a start of production targeted for 2025, 26, 27, whatever happens to be, and you can't get the supply chain in behind it to fill it. Otherwise, like I said in my previous comment, you're still going to be sourcing the materials from where you sourced before, and that doesn't necessarily help anyone.
Great, thank you, Scott. And there is a reception after this event, so you could ask Scott that very question about how long will it take till I get my electric vehicle. So set you up for that conversation.
If I can just jump back into that, because I get asked a lot, and I actually come from our manufacturing plants in Canada. That's my background, and we're about 3/4 of a year behind right now in terms of sold vehicles versus produced vehicles. And, we're trying our hardest to catch up, but it takes a while. It really is an unprecedented situation. I've worked with Toyota for 24 years and never seen anything like it. Hopefully it improves, but my concern, getting back to the point, is that these supply and demand imbalances are actually going to create other issues and repeat what we've just gone back through for the last 2-3 years.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that response. So we're just going to turn quickly to the people of the mining industry. And I did mention that by 2030, 220,000 jobs will be in mining, process, and manufacturing, just in the zero emission vehicle market alone. And the Mining Industry Human Resources Council has done a lot of analysis and forecasts that up to 113,000, a lot of new workers will be needed by 2030 to meet this new demand, and also to replace those workers anticipated to exit the mining workforce. And this is a staggering number for the sector. It's 113,000 new people. That's just amazing. Even now, a third of Canadian businesses have reported challenges with attracting and retaining talent. And something that we've heard in our industry is that companies are now poaching from one another to be able to have the talent and the skill workforce that they need for their operations. How are your organizations currently facilitating greater workforce participation? How vital is addressing this issue in the medium and long term? Saga, maybe I could start with you, and then Marcella, if you have something to add from your perspective as well, and Chris as well, if there's something you want to sprinkle on at the end.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that we have to look at, and the framework that's being used to engage Indigenous communities in the discussion around partnerships usually is an impact benefit agreement tool. And in those tools are skill development, employment, an HR mechanism to address accessing localized workforce. And in our communities, we're there, and we're not going anywhere. And we want jobs, and we want skilled jobs. So we want to look at being involved in the entire mining cycle. And I think that the work of the coalition is to create the space and create the community capacity to build comprehensive plans that allow for communities' memberships to take up those opportunities. If we're talking about 113,000 jobs, we should be looking at our communities being employed in those jobs. And I have a legal background. I've been a lawyer for a couple of decades, and I sit on a couple of publicly traded companies. And so I focus on the governance aspect in terms of my involvement, and in terms of creating the space for companies to have the discussions with communities around what is meaningful partnership, what does meaningful engagement look like. And if we don't talk about employing local Indigenous peoples in any of the mining cycles, whether it's processing or whether it's sitting on boards or whether it's in managerial roles as opposed to like underground mining roles, we're missing an opportunity to have a good, committed, localized workforce. And I think that we need to focus on that and continue to focus on that in terms of building our community capacity to be able to participate at those levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, anything from Teck's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive challenge, as you've pointed out. Getting the involvement, more Indigenous workers on our sites is a priority for us. We're blessed that Teck's year after year, one of Canada's top companies. It's still not getting this stress away from us. Like we could hire, I think the last time I looked at Elk Valley's HR needs, I think we were 150 people short on any given day, and so that's significant. I think there's a lot of good content in the critical minerals strategy, by the way, around this question. So again, good catch from our friends in the federal government, really recognizing the need to coordinate with the provinces, make sure that we're getting the right training in the right places and upgrading people's skills. I think all those things need to happen. I also think in mining specifically, we have a bit of a challenge, especially for younger folks, kind of regardless of background, where they have an image in their head of what it means to join a mining company that might prevent them from applying for those jobs. And so what I like to say is, first of all, we need to do a better job of letting them know that whatever part of the mining industry, you're going to be a part of the climate change solution. Like, these jobs are so important to the world. I think that would appeal to younger folks. I also think there's, I always like to tell people Teck is the 50th largest technology employer in British Columbia. And that's because we have our own data center. It's in Yaletown. It looks like any other high-tech firm's office. It's got the foosball tables and everything. And that data center is where AI and data analysis sit. Those folks in the last 4 or 5 years have crunched the numbers and worked to get us efficiencies, saving us almost $1 billion. And so those are, again, you want to join a tech company, come check out Teck. We've got opportunities. And I don't think we tell that part of the story enough. Same for things like water quality. There's environmental scientists. Tech's a great place to work. There's a never-ending challenge in mining with water issues. So I think that's got to be a part of it. I guess last but not least, part of what my team and I and GR have been doing is we also advocate pretty strongly with the local governments and with the province and the states we work in globally as well. Like, childcare is a big priority. You're not going to solve this human resources challenge that's coming without getting more women into the mining workforce. And guess what? In these rural, remote communities, if we don't get more childcare, it's just not going to happen. So that's something we're committed to working on as well.
Thank you for that response. Did you want to add anything, Chris, from your perspective and your growing company?
I mean, most of it has been said. I mean, there's some very important points that you guys have brought up, and I think they're all need to be incorporated. I think from we're 30 people, relative to Teck. I don't even want to guess, but you're in the thousands. 7,000. So
in Canada, 10 globally, but anyway,
yeah, so
go on.
Who's counting? Yeah. We're a different realm, right? But we have aspirations to grow, I think to 10,000 is probably not a realistic goal in quite some time. Teck's been around for a long time, has built a huge workforce amongst its mines, its operations globally. But I think the mantra that we have is definitely hire locally to compete globally. And there's a lot, Canada across the board has a lot of skill, and we do need to focus on training and upskilling where the skill is lacking to bring everybody to the workforce. And it's definitely something that we look at where we operate for sure. It's a very important piece of what we do.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Hire locally to compete globally. I like that. It's a good bumper sticker. Okay, that could happen. Okay, great. Thanks for my electric vehicle. I'll get in a long time. That's right. So I'm going to turn to our last question, and I'm going to ask all speakers, and it's a little bit of an existential question, so please bear with me in terms of, thinking of the critical mineral sector right now, and it's absolutely fascinating time for our industry in terms of significant growth, in terms of that energy transition, in terms of the inputs into clean technology. Just, the story that we've been hearing over and over again for a number of years, and it's a great narrative. And also, as Marcella mentioned, absolutely great support and leadership by the government of Canada with respect to developing the critical mineral strategy. It's an end-to-end industrial strategy, and it does cover the entire ecosystem that we need to have to be able to be successful and to be able to attain the vision of the strategy as well. But from your perspective, maybe I'll start with Scott, just so you can prepare him that he won't be going last this time. Just whether you could share what you would like to see in Canada's critical minerals industry, perhaps even if you had a bit of a crystal ball in about 10 years time, what would be your vision, and what would you like to have happen? And sometimes when you think about what you want to do in the future, you want to set those conditions for success now to be able to get to that realization and vision in that 10 years time. So Scott, do you have any thoughts for us?
Yeah, and I don't want to repeat myself or what comments that other people have made, but as I'll say, an end user, and to be clear, there's other people in the room here. It's not just about batteries. We use critical minerals that go into magnets, that go into motors. There's a lot of interested parties in here. A lot of those things show up in a car at some point. The thing we need is a concrete plan to move quickly while not leaving people behind. And when I say that, whether it's, Indigenous communities, if you're investing I'll call it $10 billion in a gigafactory in Canada, I think everybody should benefit from that. I think the Canadian community should benefit from that. The communities that we work in, live in, they should all benefit from that, and so should the people. But it really needs to be a concrete plan to move faster while bringing everybody along with us, because right now there's a lot of ambition, there's a lot of well-meaning, but there's still not quite mechanisms in place to make that happen. Not that we can see, because we want to, if we're investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, whether it's in automotive or mining or whatever it happens to be, you need investment certainty. And some of that you need to know how quickly you can move, and you need to predict these things. You need to plan for them, and that clear, crystal ball, to use your term, to know when you can get a project online and completed and through the regulatory approvals process. We need to have that sort of clarity so that we can predict and then build out to scale.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott, for those comments. And once again, we're hearing that alignment. We're hearing about, that investor confidence, and also we need to make the strategy be real and actually implement the actions that are needed to be able to get to that end goal in 10 years as well. So thank you for your comments. Marcella.
Teck is a global company, but we are very rooted in Canada. And so my hope, my dream for the next 10 years, when I look at my crystal ball, is to say that Canada's critical mineral supply chain has become the envy of the world, that we've done that in a way that's both enriched our communities, led to better participation and more ownership from our First Nations partners, that we've done it in a way that creates more diversity in our workforces, but in a way that's providing the minerals and metals that the world needs to decarbonize, and that we are part of that solution to get us to our decarbonization goals so that this planet can quit burning to the ground. So I've got a pretty ambitious, I think we can get there, by the way. I feel very positive. I think we're just in a really unique moment where the forces are aligning that can allow us to make significant progress in a sustainable and responsible way. And I think Canada can lead the world on that. And those are the values. That's how we try to take our operations when we operate in other jurisdictions. We always say, if you don't have a regulatory framework as strong as Canada, we're going to pretend that you do. And that's how we're going to operate in that jurisdiction. So I just think there's so much opportunity, and we're very positive that we can get to those goals. We're going to have to, look, it's going to be hard work. We're going to have to keep our eye on the ball, on a bunch of balls at once. But when I look in 10 years, I can see that possibility for us on the horizon.
Well said. Thank you for that. Saga.
I completely agree with you, Marcella. I think that we have to look at things in a comprehensive way, and look at having stronger relationships between government, Indigenous communities, and industry. We're getting calls. The coalition is getting calls from other countries to say, how do we build relationships with Indigenous peoples? How do we facilitate that? And what is Canada's mining sector relationship like with Indigenous peoples? And we want to say that Canada in 10 years' time is a great place to invest in. We want to be partners in that. We want to be able to promote our business opportunities in that context. And we want to do it without having to pound the table and talk about it from a rights-based perspective, and talk about FPIC. We want consent to be built right into the conversation, and as owners of that process, we would obviously consent, and we want to have the regulatory oversight and participate in that way. That maybe we own the environmental assessments, and I think that those conversations have been happening. We've been talking about a rights-based agenda for a number of years, and I would be remiss to not acknowledge the former national chief who's sitting in this room with us, and who has, along with his former colleagues, talked and created the space for us to have these conversations and to be able to look at tools like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, look at free, prior and informed consent, and look at ownership, control, and access to our own information in the context of traditional knowledge and how that plays into providing us with a framework to get to an operating mine. We wouldn't be able to be having those conversations if it wasn't for trailblazers that allowed us to get here, and for those important people that created the space for our leadership to be able to advocate for the things that we're advocating right now. And we see some really great examples that a number of communities who aren't there yet can look to and be supported by. And that's the work that the coalition is doing in terms of being able to facilitate those really important dialogues, like whether it's internationally in terms of Germany or Japan or the US. We've had those conversations and we've opened those doors. So I'm really proud to be sitting here and representing this perspective, because I see a lot of great opportunities ahead. And we have a great panel that acknowledges the important work that Indigenous peoples need to do in terms of building those relationships and partnerships.
Thank you. And it's also building that Canada brand over the next number of years and exporting that to other countries as well, and how important that is. So thank you very much for those comments. Chris, growing your workforce from 30 to 10,000 in the next 10 years, what do you see your world look like? And what would you like to see your world look like at that point?
It sounds a lot less daunting than I think it would be to go to that number. Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I would say has been said by these three very smart people on the panel. I think, looking at in NRCan, you have a background here. The NRCan has talked about a permitting reform, and wouldn't it be nice that you have the geographic location and a project type, and you can, maybe as simply as type that in to some portal, and it tells you who the people are you need to be consulting with and what the regulatory process is for your specific location. And it sounds simple, but it is the mechanisms behind something like that are just, it's enormous. It's a big lift to have that brought together, but it really needs to bring we talked about it today. I think the comment was made, we want to move it faster, but we need to do that without leaving anyone behind. And so, I think that's the real challenge. I think if from our perspective, starting a project from, base nothing to an operating processing facility, making a lithium product that goes into batteries is a massive lift. We're probably going to be 10 years from start to processing facility, which happens to be the industry average for building a process like this. So anything to do to shorten that time frame, to increase certainty, I think hopefully therefore in the 10-year window from today, you're going to see a really strong upstream industry, the foundation of a critical minerals supply chain vibrant in Canada across all critical minerals, because actions taken today are supporting it, are incentivizing, are moving, which is a lot of it is money. But the money comes when you have regulatory certainty as well. You don't need necessarily to capitalize. You need to provide a framework that creates certainty for the investors to know that if they gave money to company X, that has a big chance of resulting in a project that's making revenue down the line. So so I would love to see, and then the whole supply chain from there all the way up to the cars on the street.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chris. Before I close off the panel, I just want to first of all thank all of our online viewers. Unfortunately, you're going to have to go to your kitchens to get a beverage after this session. For those that are in the room, there'll be a reception in the back, starting right after this panel. So you can mingle, network, meet some of the panelists, and also enjoy a beverage or two. But I want to say a very big thank you, Chris, Saga, Marcella and Scott, what a wonderful panel. I learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot as well, and continue the conversation, and let's get going and make some really great progress into the future. So please, round of applause for your panelists.